Veterans Chronicles is sponsored by the state of Qatar, representing Qatar's commitment to the U.S.
Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Army Colonel James Riffe. He served 30 years in the U.S. Army. He's a veteran of World War II and fought in the horrific Battle of Okinawa in 1945. And Colonel Riffe, thanks very much for being with us today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Panther, West Virginia. That is in the southernmost part of West Virginia on the border of Virginia and Kentucky. I was born in a place called Panther, and July the 9th, 1921.
When did you join the service?
I joined the service on the 6th of August of 1942. My first assignment was with the 80th Division, which is called the Blue Ridge Division, because it's the patch is a picture of the Blue Ridge. It was a Army Reserve unit, and most of the outfit was made up from people from Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. So my first assignment was there, and they were stationed at Camp Forest, Tennessee. And so I was there, I arrived there as a private about the 7th or 8th of August of 1942, and I was assigned to a headquarters company of an infantry battalion, 318th Infantry Regiment.
Now, were you drafted or did you enlist?
Well, I drafted, but most people don't understand what that means. Actually, I was I spent 2 years in the Civilian Conservation Corps, so when I went to college, Davidson College, North Carolina, I was a 20-year-old freshman. That was pretty old. So in February of 1942, I registered for the draft. In early March of 42, I received a congressional appointment at the U.S. Naval Academy, which I accepted, of course. And then I happened to think that really, I don't know anything about the Navy, but I had a year of college ROTC, Army, and I had something back in those days, which most people never heard of, called Citizens Military Training Camps, where I went to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana, for 2 summers to be trained. So when I joined the 80th Division, I'd already gone through basic training and advanced training. So promotions came very fast. In 4 months, I was a staff sergeant in the 80th Division.
When did you go from enlisted man to officer?
I think sometime around maybe early November of 1942, when I was with the 80th Division, and one day there was a notice on the board that said the following men will, not may, will apply for Infantry Officer Candidate School, and my name was there. And so in about a week or so, I was called before a review board, and I went before a review board. And then I guess about a month later, the first sergeant, was a regular Army first sergeant, went home on Thanksgiving. And so the company commander made me the acting first sergeant and promoted me to staff sergeant. And by the way, the regimental commander called me in and said, I want to congratulate you. You're the first man in the regiment to be promoted to staff sergeant. But anyway, a few days after I got promoted to staff sergeant, the regimental adjutant called me, and he said, why aren't you in OCS? And I said, sir, I applied for it like I was supposed to, and I said, I assume I didn't clear the board, because he said, you cleared the board, you should have been the OCS a month ago. Now that company commander won't release you, and I'm going to, so on December the 24th, 1942, I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia for the Officer Candidate School. 13 months later, I was a second lieutenant.
Oh, very good. So what kind of training did you do before deploying to the Pacific?
Well, did quite a bit. My first assignment when I was commissioned, I was sent to Camp Roberts, California. And there they had an officer school. It was for captains and lieutenants. The idea was, you're going to go through the Pacific. So we're going to have a 4-week course here at Camp Roberts, California, to prepare you for combat in the Pacific. So my first assignment, I was a student there. And then when we graduated in 4 weeks, instead of my going to the Pacific, I became an instructor at the school. So I was an instructor in platoon and infantry tactics for 1 year. So I had that training as an instructor. And then instead of going to the Pacific at that time, they sent me to the Army Infantry Advanced Course back to Fort Benning for another 13 weeks. Actually, throughout my career, I always preferred to be in something in training. You know, in the battalion level, it's the S3, that's training. And the division level, it's the G3, you know. And, of course, that carries on up to training. So whenever I had the opportunity, if I had a choice, I'd ask for an assignment, which put me in the training business. So, but I loved training, and I enjoyed teaching people how to do various things.
When did they ship you out?
Well, after I got back from Fort Benning at the Officers Advanced School, I came back in about October, and I was there for about a month, and they sent me to the Pacific. And I never will forget when we arrived at San Francisco to board the ship, the headline in the newspaper was Jap subs off coast. So we got aboard this personnel transport, and they didn't tell us where we were going to go, but and 3 weeks later or so, we landed at Noumea, New Caledonia, which was a French possession on the northeast coast of Australia. And I was there for about a couple of weeks. The Army had a replacement training center there. In other words, if they didn't know where you're going to go to, you went to Noumea, New Caledonia, to the training center. Then as units in the Pacific needed people, they'd call back there and they'd send you to this. So I was there about 2 weeks, and one day with about 10 other lieutenants, we were told to go down. We boarded a cargo ship, and I don't know how many days later, we landed on the island of Espiritu Santos, which is in the South Pacific of the New Hebrides. And there I was assigned to the 27th Infantry Division.
And that's the division you would
That's the division I was with in combat. Actually, when I arrived on Espiritu Santos, I was assigned as the leader of the 1st Platoon, I Company, 106th Infantry Regiment, 27th Division. So I had an opportunity before we went to Okinawa to train with that platoon for about 3 months, which was wonderful because I got to know the men, they got to know me, and I told them that I was a staff sergeant when I got commissioned. And boy, they said, "Oh, you're one of us." So we had a great rapport with those 29 men. Unfortunately, we all thought before we went to combat that we'd get our authorized strength. At that time, an infantry rifle platoon had an authorized strength of 40 men. I had 29. So when we went to Okinawa, I had 29 men instead of 40. And they were mostly 18 and 19-year-old good Americans, and I was the senior man of the platoon at 23 at that time.
Obviously, by the time the Battle of Okinawa starts, the Allied forces are getting closer and closer to the mainland, and the Japanese resistance is getting more and more fierce. Iwo Jima had just happened, for example. Right. So what did you expect going in?
Well, we had all kinds of, what we expected, of course, I didn't know the big picture, of course. I was an infantry platoon leader as the 1st lieutenant. We didn't know the big picture, but later the big picture was that the Japanese were defending Okinawa with about 75,000 individuals. They also, of course, Okinawan civilians, which, the history of Okinawa goes back a long ways, too. And the Japanese annexed Okinawa in 1875, if I recall correctly. So they had not only the Japanese army there, but they conscripted a lot of young men. So the estimates, this is from the higher up estimates, were there were about 75,000 people. It turned out there was 110,000 there. So what the Admiral Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific, and just for a matter of orientation, the northern part of the Pacific was all under the Navy. And in the southern part, like New Guinea and Philippines, was General MacArthur. Okinawa came under Admiral Nimitz. But anyway, on the 1st of April of 1945, the 10th Army Division, commanded by Army Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, started landing on Okinawa. And what he did initially, there was, by the way, on Okinawa, there was 4 Army divisions. There was the 7th, the 27th, the 77th, and the 96th. And there was 2 Marine divisions, the 1st and the 6th Marine Division. So on April the 1st, 1945, was the 2 Marine divisions and 2 Army divisions assaulted Okinawa. And they run into very little resistance. Well, little, I say, compared to what they had run into in other islands which we invaded, you know. But it turns out that the Japanese commander there had decided to defend the south. Okinawa, by the way, is 60 miles long and about 2 to 18 miles wide. And the 2/3 of the island is all hilly and brushy and scrubby and not related very well to defense. So the Japanese defended the southern 1/3 of the island. So, but the defense initially at the landing was basically very light.
Let's pause right there. Mr.
Okay.
Riffe, we just have to hit a break as we talk about the landing. That's a perfect spot to take a quick rest. We'll be right back with retired U.S. Army Colonel James Riffe on Veterans Chronicles.
If we've learned anything this year, it's the importance of soap and supporting small American businesses that keep our economy going. That's why we're introducing Hero Soap Company, a brand that pays homage to the values our country was founded on. With a U.S. Air Force veteran as an owner, Hero Soap Company understands the dedication and sacrifice each family makes to serve. Handmade in Phoenix, Arizona, each bar of Hero Soap is crafted with ingredients sourced from U.S. companies and is free of chemicals, dyes, fragrances, and parabens. Go to HeroSoapCompany.com to subscribe for a 20% saving and have soaps delivered every month. Order any number of soaps in your subscription, and Hero Soap Company will send a one-time matching number of soaps to the troops. Plus, a portion of every sale is donated to charities that help veterans and first responders, including Operation Finally Home. Use promo code DANA at checkout and save 10% on all non-subscription orders. Suds up with the Hero Soap Company. Promo code DANA.
Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Army Colonel James Riffe, veteran of World War II. And what we're talking about much of the hour today is the battle for Okinawa. And, sir, just before our break, you were talking about the landing, so please continue.
Well, the landings were made by 2 Marine divisions, the 1st and the 6th, and 2 Armored divisions, the 77th and the 96th, and everyone was surprised because there was very little resistance, which was unusual because normally when the Marines or the Army had invaded an island, there was terrific casualties, going back to Iwo Jima, for example, for one. By the end of the first day, we had gone in across the entire island, so we cut the island in 2. On the east side of Okinawa was the Pacific Ocean, and on the west side was the East China Sea. So we cut off. So we thought, well, anything in the north, Japanese, we got a line. So, and anything in the south, we're ready to go. And so it turns out that the commander of the Japanese forces had decided to defend the south because the terrain there was more suitable for defense. And there were some old castles like Shuri Castle you may have heard about. There was a place for a good defensive position. So instead of 75,000 people there, which we expected, there was over 110,000. And that kept increasing as the battle went along. So after about the 2 Army divisions headed south, and after on about day 3, they ran into very, very heavy resistance. And the main defensive line ahead of them was called Kakuzu Ridge. And that was primarily the responsibility of the 96th Division to take Kakuzu Ridge. As it turned out, my division, the 27th, was initially the floating reserve. But when the 96th Division ran into a lot of trouble on Kakuzu Ridge, they finally secured part of it. Then my division, the 27th, went in to relieve the 96th. And at that time, I was the first lieutenant commanding an infantry rifle platoon of 29 men. So we relieved the 96th Division on this place called Caucasus Ridge. And we had been told that the Japanese attacked every night around 2 a.m. But we prepared good defensive positions. They did attack every night about 2 a.m., but we always repulsed them. And we got to thinking they must have been drunk because you could hear them coming, yak, 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 and we found out that they probably were drunk on sake. But anyway, one thing we found out very shortly was that even though they attacked at, say, 2 a.m. at night, they leave behind some snipers. And, of course, the policy was in the Pacific that the U.S. Army divisions did not attack at nighttime. They did not attack at nighttime. So what they would do in the morning, we get up and start moving around, they'd have snipers that were left in the area, and they start shooting at us. So on about maybe the second morning or the third morning as we were there, the company commander said, by the way, Luke, that's my name, Luke. My name is Lucas. So in the Pacific battles, we didn't go by rank. I was not a first lieutenant. Nobody was a sergeant or a captain or a major. And so we went by a nickname. And also we didn't wear insignia on our collars like they did in the European theater. So I was never called lieutenant. I was always Luke, you know. So anyway, the company commander said, well, Luke, you take a patrol out and see if there's any Japanese snipers that came here overnight. So I got 3 of my platoon members, and as I was getting ready to move out, overnight we had been spent with us was a second lieutenant who was a forward artillery observer. He spent the night with us. And I was moving out. He said, can I go along with you? I want to get some combat experience. And I said, well, just fall into the rear. Well, we'd gone out maybe a couple hundred feet, and there was a very, very loud explosion. Knocked me down. 2 men behind me were knocked down. The only man standing was the scout in front of me. But I heard these moans and crying and really terrible noises. And I was, of course, in shock because I'd been knocked down too. And I was trying to find what was going on. I looked down the hill, and there was this second lieutenant, forward observer. And both of his legs had been blown off just below the knees. And he was lying with his head down the hill. And I didn't realize what was going on. I finally went down to him, and I seen what was happening. He had 2 legs blown off. So I took my belt and made a tourniquet on one leg, and I took his belt, made a tourniquet on another leg. And I told the one man of the 3 who was still standing to go back to the company, get an aid person with a stretcher to come up and take this man back there. And so when the stretcher would take the man back, and one of the men said to me, Luke, your back is covered with blood. Now, I didn't realize that my whole back had been shattered with shrapnel. And so so anyway, we walked back to the battalion aid station. I guess, I don't know how far back, but we finally got back there. And I said to the battalion surgeon who was dressing me, taking the shrapnel out and dressing me, I said, now, please don't report this, because I had a brother who was in Europe, and he was seriously wounded, and he's in the hospital. And I said, I don't want my family, my mother and father, to know that the other son, the only other son, has also been wounded. So I saw him about a month later, and he said, well, Luke, he said, I look at the regulations. I have to report the fact that you're wounded. So anyway, that resulted in my receiving the Purple Heart.
Sir, let's pause one more time. When we come back, we'll tell much more of your story from Okinawa, right here on Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, joined today by Colonel James Riffe, veteran of World War II and the Battle of Okinawa. And, sir, you were just talking about the harrowing experience of one of the men in the rear of your unit losing both legs. And
yeah.
Unfortunately, that was not an isolated incident. The casualties were very difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Well, I often felt very guilty about that, because here's a man who lost 2 legs. And when he said, can I join you, I could have said no. And he'd have 2 legs today. So that's always been a very everything against me. But one good thing is I found out years later that he did survive. But I could have said, no, you can't do it. And he'd had 2 legs today, so that's very sad to me there.
What kind of fighters were the Japanese?
Well, the Japanese were good fighters, particularly when they were defending a hill or a ridge or some objective that we tried to take. They were probably of all the defensive units in the South Pacific and the Pacific, Japanese were probably the best at defense because they dig down hundreds of feet, and so you'd even have artillery in there, and and it didn't touch them, not at all. I can remember on Caucasus Ridge, we used to look over to the escarpment, and they had tunnels dug from the far side, and they come up, and their face of the tunnel was facing us about maybe 1,500 yards away on Caucasus Ridge, and they'd fire at us. And of course, sound travels at the rate of 1,086 feet per second. So when we'd see the flash, we'd start counting, and then over how many seconds we got, then we call artillery. But our artillery come in, they just go back in the hills. So they were very good at that. But the Japanese, I think the most unusual thing about the Japanese, which I didn't understand until much later when I got to Japan in September of 1945, sometimes you come face to face with a Japanese soldier. Instead of him fighting, he'd kill himself. They had grenades, and their grenades were different from ours. They had to hit the ground, but they'd killed himself. Didn't understand that why until I got to Japan and began to study the Japanese as a nationality and their history, and found out, of course, the Emperor Hirohito, was at that time the Emperor of Japan, and he was the supreme commander of the Army and the Navy and the Air Forces. And when you were born in Japan at that time, you took an oath that you would defend and die for the Emperor. So the feeling I got was that they would rather kill themselves, they're dying for the Emperor, than have me kill them. Okay. And so that surprised me. And then I don't know, but it seems at nighttime when they attack, you could hear them coming. And someone said later that they were high on sake, Japanese liquor or some kind, I guess. And you could hear them coming. So, but they were very good. They very few of them surrendered. I didn't. My outfit. We didn't take any Japanese prisoners because they would rather die. So they were very tenacious. They were good defenders, and you had to kill them to take a ridge or a strategic point that the Army wanted you to take. So they were good fighters. They were good fighters.
Given their proficiency, how did you and your other commanders change tactics, and how much more difficult was that as a result of all the losses you were taking?
Well, I think the big thing on Okinawa that was really significant in our being able to advance, the U.S. Navy had the largest number of aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, PT boats than they had any place else in the Pacific. So when we wanted to get some fire. We first we get our own mortar fire, and we get our own division artillery fire. But when there was a forward artillery observer, and you tell him that you wanted to put some fire on a certain place, now you might get Army artillery, or you could get Navy gunships, and I mean they could really throw in a lot of stuff. So I would say that in many areas we were able to conquer a ridge or something like that because of the naval gunfire that we got, because they were big bombs, they really tore up a lot. So, of course, the Japanese again, were on the south part of Okinawa, particularly some of the old buildings that were there underground. The Japanese went underground there a couple hundred feet, and of course they took the island was supposedly called secured on the 23rd day of June, but that don't mean a great deal, of course. It just means that we were in control, not that all the Japs are dead. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, but
you did. I think you raised an important point there. You talk about the landing in April, and midsummer, this is still going on all the way up to...
Well, yeah, but because the Japanese, again, had... in the south, the ridges were east-west, which was ideal for defense, as opposed to the north, which was hilly and brushy, and so the Japanese had very few people up there. So they had these series of ridges going all the way back. Now, of course, from the time we hit them to go south was only 20 miles. But every inch was defended, not only by the Japanese soldiers, but the Japanese military of all branches, and they had, of course, the Japanese, the Okinawan civilians. They had them in there too. So it was a difficult, and one thing that slowed us down on Okinawa was in May, when we were making pretty good progress toward the south. The capital of Okinawa was called Naha, and that was the main objective because we knew that's where the commanding general of the Japanese forces had his headquarters. But in May, they had 16 inches of rain, and I recall that at that time my battalion was attacking in the north of Vietnam, and I remember a place called Onataka, and it was sort of straight up, and we couldn't hardly get up the hill because it was so raining so much. So that slowed down the people a lot. So the Marines took a lot of casualties. They had 2 divisions in there. The Army at that time had 3 were fighting, so we had suffered terrific casualties to get through there. But of course, we finally made it, but it took a long time, and we had a lot of casualties.
Talk a little bit about your advancement, I guess, in responsibility because of all the events that were happening there. You started as a platoon commander, went up to a company commander, eventually an intelligence officer, and other roles, all during the time of this battle.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I had started out with 29 men in this platoon, and we should have had 30. But anyway, as I'll mention later, the number of casualties that I suffered at one platoon. So I was a platoon leader initially, and of course, later on I'd like to tell you how I got a different job, if I may. But the weather was a factor, the visibility was a factor, and the Japanese tenacious defenders was a factor also. But eventually, we were able to proceed toward the south. At that time, my division had been detailed to go back up north because we 6th Marine Division, it went up there initially in those mountains areas, and 30 miles up there. The Japanese, as they were being pushed back in the south, they get in boats and go back to the north. But anyway, on the 23rd day of June, the island was declared secured. And I just want to mention that General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Lieutenant General, Army, he was visiting a Marine observation post, and he was killed. And the senior general on the island was a Major General Marine Corps. So the first time in the history of the Army, a Marine commanded an Army.
So you mentioned your job change. How did that happen?
When we left Kakuzu Ridge to head south, we assumed that that when we left there, that another Army unit would take over in the reserve. It turned out that didn't happen, so the Japanese they took over the Caucasus Ridge area. So my battalion was withdrawn from the south to help retake Caucasus Ridge. Anyway, we were attacking, and it so happens that my platoon was on the left flank of the entire force that was attacking. And we were on the side of a hill, and I'd go from one little gully to the ridge and down and so forth. And as we moved along, I had a scout, two scouts, and a BAR man, Browning automatic rifleman. And the rest of the platoon I'd keep in the draw with the platoon sergeant. But somewhere, I don't know exactly when, but we ran into the Japanese. My lead scout was killed immediately. And the BAR man was seriously wounded, and I crawled over to him, and he'd been shot through the left upper thigh, right through the bone and everything, and he was screaming. And I crawled over to him, and in a minute or two, the first aid man come running up. And each platoon had a first aid man, by the way. And I thought, well, he was back in the draw, but the BAR man who'd been wounded in the left thigh was screaming. I guess he heard him, so he came up, and I was on my knees trying to do something for the BAR man, and the first aid man came up, and he got on his knees right beside me. And by the way, as I mentioned, or didn't mention, maybe the lead scout was killed instantly. He was, he was in front, and he got killed instantly. The first aid man came up, and we were both on our knees trying to help the BAR man. And as the first aid man was reaching for his first aid kits, the Japanese opened fire and killed him immediately. And that's the only time that I could ever hear the bullets whizzing by my head. And I knew that I came within, 2 or 3 minutes of being killed myself. And I often asked, why not me? And even today, I said, I came so close to being killed, why not me? But anyway, that was in the battle, but then I got a call to go back to the company headquarters. And the company commander said the last officer in K Company has been killed or wounded, and the battalion commander wants you to take over K Company. Well, I took over K Company. The S3 got dengue fever and got evacuated, and they made me the acting S3, and it went on from there, and I never did get to go back to the company. I stayed in the staff either as the intelligence officer or as the plans and operations officer from about August of 1945 until the division went home in December of 1945. And so during that period, I got promoted to captain.
Given the vicious fighting that you experienced on Okinawa, how relieved were you when we dropped the bombs on Japan and you knew you didn't have to be part of a ground campaign there?
Well, if you'd been on Okinawa that night, you had never known how the sky could be lit up. We just knew that the Japanese surrendered. We didn't know why they surrendered. We knew there was an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We didn't know that. We just know the Japanese surrendered. The word got out, and believe me, all night long, everybody was shooting their weapons up into the sky. So it was a great blessing, and because the war was over and we had suffered so many casualties throughout the Pacific and Europe, of course. As a matter of fact, during World War II, we lost 406,000 Americans, and that's in the Pacific and in Europe altogether. So we were very pleased, and of course we didn't know what was going to happen, but it turned out that on the 5th of September, my battalion was airlifted to Japan, and as I mentioned, our job was to demilitarize Japan, and we were given a section, the west section of the island of Honshu, to demilitarize. That's where I got the samurai sword.
We're talking with World War II veteran, U.S. Army veteran of 30 years, Colonel James Riffe, here on Veterans Chronicles. And in our last few minutes, sir, let's Talk about that. Folks will be able to see the pictures of the swords. Explain how you got them.
Well, the officer's sword, I got it, I think, on the Caucasus Ridge. And it's amazing that I have that sword today because our chaplain, our battalion chaplain, when we were in defensive position, he'd always come up and have services, And believe me, everybody went to service, And so I had this bling beside me. He said, what's you going to do with it? I said, well, I don't know. I said, it's sort of nice, and I like the way I got it. He said, well, I got a Jeep, and I put it in my Jeep in the trailer. And I said, okay. So I forgot all about it, and we got to Japan. We got there the 5th of September, and sometime after that he said to me, he said, Luke, I've got your Japanese officer's sword. So that's how, it's amazing how I got it to him. So it's been precious. I have 3 grandsons, and when they were very small, they'd come out and say, Granny, can I see your swords? And they all won them. So I've got 3 grandsons and 2 swords. This is a samurai sword. So this is going to be a big decision for me, how I distribute 2 swords to 3 grandsons.
Well, as I mentioned, we've mentioned several times now, this was not the end of your career when the war came to an end. You stayed in the U.S. Army for, as you said, a little over 30 years. How do you think your experience in the war influenced how you led as an officer for the rest of your career?
Well, the primary objective that I learned was to protect your men. Protect your men. You have the Army, if you want to take a hill, they'll give you a part of it called the objective, or later on they might call it the goal or something. But I found out if your men comes first, they may tell you to take a hill, but the taking that hill is not first to me. Taking that hill without any loss of my men. So ever since that time, I've been personnel oriented. The rest of my life, I've been personnel. And so it's to take care of your men. However, I just mentioned here that I landed on Okinawa with 29 men. They were 18 and 19 years old. And at the time I led them was about maybe 6 weeks or so before I went to the battalion staff. 7 of those young men got killed, and 14 got seriously wounded and evacuated, and I never saw them again. And they're part of my life, and I think of them every day, and I can see them, and I wonder what their lives would be like today if they weren't a casualty of World War II. And I wonder about the families when they got word that their son was, killed in action and so forth. So that's the reason that I've delayed coming here for a long, long time, because it is not a pleasant experience, because it recalls, even though I commanded a rifle company briefly on Okinawa before I went to the staff. Later on, I've commanded rifle companies, constabulary troops. I've commanded battalions. I've commanded brigade in the 82nd Airborne Division. I was chief of staff of the 82nd Airborne Division. I was a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the Military Committee to NATO. I had a lot of jobs, but nothing was like leading a platoon of 29 young men. Unfortunately, as I say, many of them didn't make it back to their home.
Sir, we're just about out of time, just a couple of minutes left. I do want to note one other part of your career. You were in Germany right around the time that the Berlin Wall was going up. Explain what that was like.
Well, I was a student at the Army War College in 1960 and 61, and I got a call from the personnel office and headquarters, UCOM in Heidelberg. They said there's an opening for a G3, that's planned, is training up in Berlin, and we've nominated you for that position. Will you take it? And I said, well, that's behind that's in the Soviet zone, 112 miles from the British zone into the East Germany, and West Germany into Berlin. And they said, well, look at this. If you take it, your wife and family will go with you. You will fly first class in aircraft. When you get to Berlin, you'll be met. They'll take you to a house which is already furnished. The refrigerator's full of food. I said, I'll take it. Well, I got there in Berlin on the 3rd day of September 1962. 10 days later, August the 13th, East Germans started building the wall. And, of course, I was the G3, Plans, Operations, and Training. And about midnight, I got a call from my operations post, which I was responsible for, that something's wrong. Our patrols cannot get into East Berlin. So we alerted all the staff, and we got ready. And, of course, I was the G3, and I was supposed to make recommendations as to what to do, And I'd only been there, 10 days, but I had a very good staff, about 45 or 50 people. My deputy was a major, West Point graduate, an outstanding officer who eventually made 3 stars. And he said to me, we have one tank that has a bulldozer on the front. So when I was supposed to, as a G3, I'm supposed to recommend to the commanding general what we should do. 1, 2, 3, 4, in this order. And do I have the approval of the G1, the G2, the G4, and so forth? So, of course, it was a big problem, and the Allied staff with all the generals, they had a meeting. So I made my presentation to the chief of staff, who was a brigadier general, and he said, that's fine, Jim. When the commanding general of Berlin, U.S. forces, Berlin comes back, make a presentation. And so when the commanding general came back for the Allied meeting, he said, the decision has been made. There will be no military actions. Everything will be political. And so the chief of staff said to me, Jim, I want you to put that in writing and put it in your safe in case it ever comes up. Well, it did come up about 2 years later. The Department of the Army sent a message in and said, do you ever consider tearing down the wall? Chief of Staff said, Jim, just send him back a copy of your orders, which I did. But I was in that job for 28 months. And, of course, it was on the 19th of October of 1962, we almost went to war. We had a tank company which had 35 tanks, and the headquarters in Heidelberg reinforced us with another battle group, so we had 3 battle groups. So up on the east-west border between the U.S. and the Soviet sector, we had tanks up there, we had infantrymen up there, and the Russians. You probably heard of Checkpoint Charlie, is that you?
Yes.
That's where we had some tanks up there, and the major who commanded those tanks was with them, and he was coming back to me. I'm the G3. I'm supposed to recommend what to do. And so we were there, and our tanks were loaded and with ammunition. And if we'd give the order to fire, they could just fire like that. And so we sat there overnight until the next day, about 10 o'clock in the morning. The major called me, and he said, the Soviet tanks are withdrawing. And General Lucius D. Clay, if you've ever heard of him, he was after World War II, he was the commander of Berlin. And a lot of things are today, like this Clay Alley and so forth. He was with us, of course. And I said to him, General Clay, the Soviet tanks had withdrawn. And he had a direct communication with President Kennedy, and he picked up the line and said, Mr. President, he said, we have won. The Soviet tanks have withdrawn. So things began to cool down. That was 19th of October 1962. But, of course, the wall didn't come down until, 1989. But
right.
I was in that job for 28 months. And I finally got permission to trade job with another friend of mine and took over an infantry battalion. And that's where I stayed until I came back to the States in 1964.
stressful time for the U.S. in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was happening, too.
That's right. Yeah, it was. It was.
Mr. Riffe, it's been a true honor having you as our guest, sir. Thank you so much for your service to our country, not only during the war, but for 30 years in service to the United States. And again, thank you for sharing what I know is a difficult story for you.
Thank you, and airborne all the way.
You got it, sir. U.S. Army Colonel, retired James Riffe, veteran of World War II and the Battle of Okinawa. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.